You think you're going to hear some jokes, don't you?
The word is snob.
You got a white folks complex.
Somebody was awfully interested in these words.
Think about that for 2 minutes and tell me you don't want to walk into the ocean.
I think there's something pretty incredible about stand-up comedy. Browsing Netflix, you'll find movies with multi-million-dollar budgets showcasing state-of-the-art special effects, providing the greatest spectacles that any human has ever witnessed on a screen for entertainment. You'll find television shows with dozens of locations to support large casts of characters as they thread multiple plot lines through episode after episode. You'll find animations that an entire team of overworked and underpaid artists painstakingly rendered from scratch as they produce fantastical worlds that no camera could ever hope to capture. And among all of them, not just competing but thriving, is a genre that consists nearly entirely of a person standing alone on a relatively barren stage and just talking. One person and the connection they build with an audience towards a singular goal, with quite possibly the purest distillation of rules of any art form to get there. Make them laugh. According to Dr. John Limon, professor of English at Williams College, stand-up as an ideal genre has 3 rules all centered around the second-person plural of you, meaning the audience. 1. If you think something is funny, it is. 2. A joke is funny if and only if you laugh at it. 3. Your laughter is the single end of stand-up. That's it. Stand on a stage with a microphone and make the audience laugh. So what does stand-up offer that those big-budget alternatives don't? In the spirit of George Carlin, all the bullshit is stripped away, and you're left with a person addressing an audience as themselves in first person. The theatrics, the skits, and even the responsibilities we may feel to uphold the myths of our society, pretense is not welcomed in stand-up, even as we all agree that it's just a show. Stand-up can make the horrifying funny, can make us question our core assumptions, and can even let us spot the truth in lies. This is a video series about the power that stand-up comedy holds, the abuse it can perpetuate, and the good that it can do instead. But more than anything, this is a love letter to my favorite art form.
On our first wedding anniversary, he gave me luggage. It was packed.
Stand-up comedy is an art form that, with very few technical exceptions, has remained unchanged since the 1800s. Someone goes on a stage, alone, and addresses an audience with the goal of making them laugh. According to Wayne Federman, a prolific comedian, producer, and adjunct professor of stand-up history at the University of Southern California School of Dramatic Arts, the first stand-up comic performance was born out of a 19th century lecture format. Lectures were considered an elevated form of entertainment that promoted knowledge, literacy, and virtue, kind of like very long TED Talks. On November 26, 1861, Charles F. Brown, going by Artemus Ward, capitalized on the popularity of the humorous letters he published in the newspaper he worked at by giving a lecture titled Babes in the Wood. Instead of ever addressing the topic, whatever it was, Ward just went on a bunch of comedic tangent, delivered in a deadpan style as if he did not even dimly suspect that there was anything funny about what he was saying, and it was incredibly effective. That quote was from Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, in his 1897 book, How to Tell a Story. After seeing Artemus Ward perform, Clemens was also inspired to give this humorous style of lecture a try. Thanks to the existing popularity of his acclaimed books and newspaper articles, his lecture circuit would rival even the most popular stand-up tours today, and this was before the existence of air travel. Artemus Ward and Mark Twain make up one half of the 4 forefathers of stand-up comedy. Our next forefather, born in 1874, was America's first black superstar comedian, but I can't utter one more word without discussing the history and comedic purpose of minstrel shows in the United States. Minstrel shows began in the late 1820s when owning slaves was still legal in half of the United States and were built around a core of white actors donning blackface to dehumanize, demean, and otherwise humiliate African Americans in order to charm and delight a white audience. In sharp contrast to the more classical tastes of the upper classes, minstrel shows appealed to the lower class and working class immigrants, in no small part because they served up an even lower caste of people to mock and belittle. At its height in the mid-1800s, it was insanely popular, and its audience grew from poor workers in the Bowery district of New York City to Queen Victoria of England, who reportedly had a grand time watching a traveling minstrel show from the USA. blackface minstrelsy was possibly the first theatrical form that was distinctly American, and its popularity sowed the influence for future uniquely American art forms like jazz, persecuting minorities, and stand-up comedy. This is still a video about stand-up history, so I will not be doing the topic justice. For that, I'd heavily recommend this video by Khadija Mbowe about the history and contemporary digital versions of blackface in media. As the structure of minstrel shows became more formalized, they began to feature comedic stump speeches in the middle of the show, consisting of a straight-ahead, first-person presentation of material to the audience, often centered around politics. Additionally, minstrel shows featured two endmen, comics who utilized a set-up punchline structure of insults, puns, wordplays, and jokes that helped blaze the path for modern-day joke construction, as well as the concept of the straight man in a duo performance, who acted as the foil to a comedic, bumbling caricature. I'm sure I don't need to tell you what the bumbling caricature in minstrel shows looked like. One of these endmen, however, was our aforementioned Bert Williams. An immigrant from the Bahamas, Williams joined Martin and Selig's Mastodon Minstrels in 1893 after graduating high school while he was still a teenager. You might ask, why would a black man voluntarily don blackface to join a performing troupe designed around mocking black people? And for that, here's a clip.
They had limited options. They were expected to.
Why?
Because it made the audiences comfortable. You can be fascinated, you can be excited, but you can always feel superior.
But hey, he made the most of it. While he was part of Martin and Selig, he met his future partner, fellow African-American George Walker, and they teamed up to leave the minstrel show to start a successful 16-year comedy force and reached unprecedented heights for a black duo of comedy entertainers. At a time when white and black audiences alike had their own vastly different views of what constituted a true representation of the black experience, Williams and Walker had to toe the line between countering the horrendous depictions of black life minstrel shows typically presented and keeping a white audience keen on violently stomping out the threat of black success in check. They embodied classical stereotypical characters like Jim Crow and, you can just read that one, but they frequently subverted expectations. They used the characters more as references, while their often incisive and socially aware dialogue exchanges created the actual humor. Because they towed that line, and because they were so genuinely funny, they were able to offer the most authentic black voices ever put on a stage while becoming the standard against which other comedy acts were compared. Williams wasn't the only non-white forefather of stand-up comedy. Cherokee citizen Will Rogers, over his 20-plus year career, became a certified American folk hero for his trailblazing work in topical political humor.
You know, he was held about every other political job there was to hold, and there was a time about 2 or 3 years after the war, it was just a man we needed. He didn't do nothing, but that's what we wanted done.
David Letterman, Jon Stewart, and John Oliver all work in the comedic shadow of Will Rogers. Starting as a cowboy lasso expert for a Wild West show in what is today's South Africa, of all places, Rogers developed a mastery of showmanship that included knowing how to turn onstage miscues into hilarious self-deprecating throwaways. He eventually moved back to the States with an act that started phasing out rope tricks in favor of more comedy philosophy until he was a comedy legend. He became so beloved and popular that on May 30th, 1916, he became the first comedian to deliver jokes about the president, Woodrow Wilson at the time, to the president, who came to one of his shows in Baltimore. It was also around this time that a new industry started to emerge that modernized and corporatized American show business: vaudeville. These were family-friendly variety shows that showcased singers, dancers, musicians, contortionists, trapeze artists. They really did earn the title of variety show. Among these acts was the comedy monologuist, an early incarnation of the stand-up comic, whose services were in demand because they not only required almost nothing in terms of stage equipment, but actually gave stagehands time to transition in between acts. Vaudeville was standardized to the point where there were even major and minor leagues, and headliners in big-time vaudeville could pocket $2,500 a week at a time when the average American worker was taking home $3,300 per year. Despite growing out of the skeezy, booze-soaked variety shows of the mid to late 1800s, vaudeville found its brand and massive success by making its shows squeaky clean. We're talking Sunday school levels of speech codes. No profanity, no innuendos, and no politics. Comedians were subject to intense reviews of their material on stage by the theater managers, and would receive blue envelopes containing anything in their act deemed too offensive. If they didn't immediately remove said material by the next time they went on stage, they'd be fired. If a comedian decided to do it anyway, they were working blue, which is where the term comes from. So, what kind of acts did these squeaky clean vaudeville-era comedians present? almost exclusively exaggerated racial and ethnic stereotypes of Black, Irish, Jewish, Chinese, Mexican, and other groups, especially immigrants. No politics, though. You can make as many derogatory ethnic jokes as you want, but you can't talk about the injustices and civil rights of these groups, because that would make it political. A proud tradition that continues to this day. To be fair, organized pressure to eliminate racial and ethnic stereotypes from these shows dates all the way back to 1905, especially after comedians started going after the Catholics. Protesting against comedians is not a recent development in America. As vaudeville started to die off in the 20s and 30s thanks to the popularity of radio and cinema, comics found new live venues in nightclubs where they could tailor their shows to more adult audiences. Since not every club had an actual stage, a lot of comics performed on the dance floor, mere inches away from the audience. Comedians like Don Rickles and Jackie Gleason cut their teeth in these close-up environments that valued improvisation and ad-libbing. It was during the nightclub era that the term stand-up was coined, first printed on June 23, 1948 in Variety. It was a versatile descriptor, something you do, something you are, and also a modifier. However, nightclubs were not the ideal environment for groundbreaking stand-up comedy. Many of them grew out of the speakeasies, taverns, and saloons that blossomed during Prohibition. So not only were they drinking and schmoozing sites first and theaters second, but now the censors might skip the fine and take out your kneecaps. To quote Jackie Gleason, "I can't think of anything more unsatisfying than trying to be intelligent in a nightclub. What's the point of talking politics and sociology to a bunch of drunks?" As radio and TV and cinema kept on gaining more popularity, stand-ups were getting more opportunities in venues to perform. Late-night talk shows like The Ed Sullivan Show and Johnny Carson's The Tonight Show gave comics a national stage to gain notoriety.
So they advertise, "This is your bank." Well, last week I walked into my bank. I wanted to see how I was doing. Then I walked behind the counter. I wanted to look at my vault. And then a guard whose salary I paid took out a gun I bought and threw me out of my bank. I got mad. Listen, it's true.
It was also around this time, the late 50s and 60s, that a certain ethos around comedians began to take hold. But we'll save that for the next video. Coffee houses started to feature stand-up comics as entertainment alongside folk musicians and beatnik poets. I don't know, I didn't look up the history of coffee houses. But one of these cafes, envisioned as a hip hangout where Broadway performers could relax after a show, despite the fact that they didn't even have enough money to cover the exposed brick on the back wall of their small stage, became the birthplace of the comedy club, the Improv on West 44th Street in 1963. It took a while, but eventually in 1972, a second New York comedy club opened, and then one in LA, and soon the comedy club concept, where multiple comics would take the stage in a night, including a headliner, began to duplicate itself across the country. The stand-up comedy boom was on its way. With the thirst for real voices and more irreverent, raunchy humor, the late 70s were primed for raw, uncensored comedy specials on the newly formed HBO. Although not the first comedian to appear on the network, George Carlin's 1977 special On Location at USC cemented both the network's reputation for quality and uncensored stand-up comedy and a new age of relevance for the medium. Carlin closed his set that night with an updated version of his famous routine, the 7 words you can never say on television.
Shit, piss, fucking cocksucker, motherfucker, tits, fart, turd, twat. Turd, you can't say turd on TV, but who wants to? I don't care if I ever hear that one again.
Just a few years before, a radio station aired a version of this routine at 2 p.m. in the afternoon that led to a complaint and eventual Supreme Court decision. Now here was Carlin, on television, saying the words you can never say on television. Outside of TV, comedy clubs continued to pop up like weeds. Stand-up comedy as a form of entertainment has a pretty low bar for entry, both for the performer and the venue seeking to host. Comedy rooms only really needed 4 things: a liquor license, access to talent, a working microphone system, and tables and chairs. With both a cover charge and an alcohol minimum, usually 2 drinks, clubs were making so much money off of these performances that they were actually able to pay the talent. And thanks to the successful comedian strike of 1979, sometimes they actually did that. The boom eventually died out in the 90s, but thanks to the ridiculously successful stand-up comedian to sitcom pipeline, the art never really left the public's consciousness. Seriously, look at this incomplete list of sitcoms starring 90s stand-up comedians. Margaret Cho's All-American Girl, Andrew Dice Clay's Anthony Clark's Boston Dave Chappelle's, Sam Kinnison's, Charlie Geraldo's, Sue Costello's, Richard Lewis and Don Rickles, Daddy Dearest, Maya Watsuki's Davis Rules, The Ellen Show, Chris Rock's Everybody Hates Chris, Romano and Brad Garrett's Everybody Loves Raymond, Brett Butler's Grace Under Fire, Mark Curry's Hanging with Mr. Lewis and Kevin Nielsen's, Tim Allen's Home Improvement, D.L. Hughley's The Jamie Foxx Show, the Jeff Foxworthy Ralph Harris's On Our Own, Kevin James's The King of Queens, John Mendoza's Eddie Griffin's Malcolm Lawrence's, Kevin Pollak's Norm Macdonald and Artie Lang's The Norm Show, Paul Reiser's Mad About You's The Richard Jennings Platypus The Sinbad Show, Steve Harvey Stephanie Hodges, Marlon and Sean Wayans at The Wayans Brothers. Although market oversaturation and simple greed from club owners played a large part in the decline of stand-up in the 90s, TV really did almost kill the stand-up star. But not for the reason you may think. Unlike how the movies killed vaudeville with more expensive sets, props, and a single take that could be played over and over, there really wasn't anything separating the stand-ups on HBO and Showtime from the kid at your local open mic night, other than the quality of their material. As such, audiences were expecting the kind of road-polished sets they saw from professionals on television from amateurs in a converted coffee house. Nearly half of all road work in the US dried up, and even some of the most iconic clubs in the country had to close their doors. This meant that live comedy shows had to offer something different in order to stay alive. And so, alternative comedy started to emerge, sets that were even less jokey and more personal. Material was crafted less for drunk tourists and more for comedy fans. The more traditional safe comedy never died, and the rebellious spark of the 60s never truly went away, but the art needed something new, and so these more experimental sets aimed at the true comedy nerds were getting a foothold.
Okay, so, I smell bad, as a rule. I have about 2 good minutes a day out of the shower. I have about 2 good minutes. If you catch me, we're good to go, but after that, and I think it's because I hate myself so much that the odor comes from the inside and just goes out. And it's like, kind of like hummus meets vinyl. It just pours off of me, and it's just the stench of utter defeat and unrealized goals. And with that, let me bring on your first act. How's that?
Hackneyed sets were sniffed out and shunned, and the traditional gatekeepers of the art form often had little say in what went on. Comics could be weirder than ever, and now there wasn't a cop in the audience waiting to see if the wrong line was crossed. Shows like Uncabaret not only encouraged, but demanded fresh material by forbidding even big-name comics like Patton Oswalt and Margaret Cho from using material from their act. The alt scene started small, but it had a large influence on the modern tapestry of stand-up comedy. Black stand-up comedy especially was experiencing a renaissance, including the massively influential black-owned and operated club All Jokes Aside in Chicago and Def Comedy Jam, a hip-hop-infused stand-up show on HBO. On the other end of the mainstream spectrum, the old-school bankable titans of the industry were getting more attention than ever. The 4-comic super show was being established as a template and would lead to cultural juggernauts like the Blue Collar Comedy Tour and the original Kings of Comedy, with its plethora of spin-offs. Oh yeah, and around the late 90s and early aughts, the internet was becoming a thing. That turned out to be a big deal. The internet made the stand-up circuit more democratic than ever and gave performers direct and immediate access to their fans. By 2010, a new stand-up boom was ushered in, bolstered by YouTube clips and podcasts and Netflix specials. Comedy has never been more popular, and there's absolutely nothing that will put a stop to the greatest, simplest art form to ever—
State by state, residents now being ordered to stay indoors. Non-essential businesses told to close.
Fuck. Yeah, the biggest draw of stand-up comedy, the intimacy and immediacy and physicality that allows a single person to engage with an audience without the use of any additional theatrics, is also its biggest flaw. The audience doesn't just determine whether or not something is funny. They decide what is and is not a joke. Without them, you simply don't have a stand-up show. And it's not just the connection between comedian and audience that's lost. Laughter is largely a social response, and much like the virus in question, spreads much better when it spews from the mouths of lots of people in close proximity. With live indoor stand-up put on hold, comedians had to adapt. Some opted for outdoor shows, like Dave Chappelle's mini-festival near his home in Ohio.
This is weird and less than ideal circumstances to do a show. But the only way to figure out if this shit will actually work is to do the goddamn show. So thank you all for coming.
But even an outdoor show can get crowded enough to pose risks. The last 6 shows were canceled due to a possible COVID exposure in their inner circle. Drive-in comedy in parking lots was another creative option, with the comics' audio broadcast over FM radio and audience reactions delivered via flashing headlights and car horns. But by far the most common and safest venue for live stand-up during the pandemic was online, via one of a dozen different streaming platforms. This option was by no means introduced during the pandemic. An entire generation of young stand-ups had lived their lives with one foot in the internet, and so for some, it seemed like the next logical step, even without a virus forcing their hand. Streaming live stand-up has its challenges, though. Audience reactions are limited to scrolling lines of emotes or LOLs that show up several seconds after the punchline, all but ruining the tight timing a comic relies on for feedback, in addition to performing in silence. Some tried workarounds, like unmuting a select few enthusiastic audience members in a Zoom call, but that hardly begins to approximate a room full of laughter. On the plus side, if you're bombing, it sounds the same as a good set, so at least there's that. And there are plenty of upsides to streaming stand-up too. You can perform for people across the globe from your bedroom. You can get tips in real time without interrupting your set or bothering the audience. And you don't have to live in or near a city with a comedy club to do a set. You don't need an in with a club manager or industry experience or an established history of road work. You just need some good material and a phone. Whether this is the next evolution in stand-up comedy or a separate entry into the pantheon of internet comedy remains to be seen. Okay, so even if there are peaks and valleys and more valleys, stand-up is firmly cemented as an art form that can endure and adapt through the ages. From its roots in lectures, to vaudeville acts, to Working Blue on television, to TikTok, stand-up shows that we have not evolved past the charm and simplicity of someone on a stage telling a good joke. So what separates it from other forms of comedy? And why don't we see other genres, action, drama, what have you, seeing the same success in the one person on a stage format? Find out in the next video. Authenticity and intimacy in stand-up, or whatever I decide to call it.